Chapter 37. God Cries. As she approached the district, Ash programmed the vehicle to make a detour on her way into the Bolt's parking garage. The car stopped on the lowest level of the athletic complex. She designated a small clearing and set the vehicle down on the forested level. Mono slept, curled up in the back seat. Ash climbed out and the fresh air filled the car. Mono stirred. He spotted Ashley outside the open door and leapt from the vehicle. She pulled out his bag of food and opened it up, pouring out a small stack for the huge cat. She rolled the bag closed again and set it next to the pile. She knew if anything happened to her, Jeffrey would hear about the giant cat and find Mono soon enough. She just hoped she got to see them together again. Ash hugged the giant cat and climbed back into the car. Mono didn't appear disappointed with his new home. With a flick of his tail, he moved off to explore it. Far above the district, a vehicle kicked out from the cableway. It maintained its heading and elevation, but drifted like a boat pushed out over calm water. A figure stepped out of the vehicle. Wearing a bulky gravity suit, he drifted away from the vehicle as if he were in outer space. The floating agent held a long rocket launcher. Composed of 3 tubes bundled together, the launcher had a triangular shape. Another figure exited the vehicle carrying a similar rocket launcher, and he too quickly disappeared. 2 additional agents stepped out, their hands free of the cumbersome rockets. The 4 agents floated, invisible, above the district. They switched their optics over to infrared and located each other. Hand signals initiated the mission, and 2 operatives dropped to the left. 2 remaining agents moved to their assigned coordinates and prepared the rockets. They raised the launchers and aimed, not directly at the district, but to its sides, and fired individually. Small rockets shot from the tubes, unraveling magnetic cables in their wake. The agents turned 90 degrees to the left or right and fired a second cable the length of the district. They fired again, this time up or down, 3 cables extending from each agent's corner. They dropped the launchers and moved to the cables themselves. As the empty launch tubes fell to Earth, the agents physically crossed the tips of the charged cables. The magnetic lines clung to each other with a love that could only be described as scientific. Once the magnetic lust of the corner knots was activated, the charge pulled each cable tight. They stretched themselves square, tightened by the forces at each corner. The district was locked down. No magnetic or anti-gravity vehicle could move through the planes created by the cables, not without the proper coded frequency. Usually municipal authorities were the ones to execute this particular law enforcement procedure, known as a lockbox, during hostage situations. For invisible agents to be firing a stateside lockbox in the dead of night was rare, and with the exception of extreme cases of national security, deemed highly illegal. The combat engineers returned to their anchored vehicle and were joined by a 5th soldier. Captain Gray, already familiar with the district, pinpointed specific locations and mapped out secure routes. Each of the soldiers carried a full pack of demolitions gear, pulling them from the back of the truck. They would spend the next 4 hours wiring every bridge, strut, and connector in the district. They would make no sound and leave no trace. The explosives would be so cleverly concealed, only detailed instructions or expensive scanners would reveal their placement. The ionized energy drives, attached to their backs, saturated the immediate area with deflective light particles, preventing objects from reflecting light onto them. Everything within a 4-foot diameter was invisible. No one could see them with the naked eye. First Sergeant King, codenamed Tarnum, and Corporal Suppressa would set charges along the connections between the athletic complex and the Bolt, while Captain Gray would take care of the terminal buildings, the schools, and the administration building. Staff Sergeant Splitter was assigned to cover Ashley, while Captain Snow would handle God's Hotel and the orphanage. Once the charges were set, the agents would regroup below the old orphanage for the second phase of the mission. It was exactly 11:59 when the wagon parked in the Bolt's garage on District 13. Gray hadn't told her why that was important, but she was on time, regardless. Ashley popped the passenger side hatch, holding the handle so it wouldn't make a thud as it opened. She pulled her backpack, hoverboard, and sword from the car, before locking it shut. Crouched beside the cooling vehicle, Ashley adjusted the pack between her shoulders and peered at the guards from over the car's hood. The sergeants hadn't registered her arrival. Undoubtedly their computer had, but a terminal can't force its custodian to follow up on every event it logs. Ash had parked behind the greatest number of unoccupied vehicles in the most remote section of the lot. Now she studied the surrounding architecture with Jeff's binoculars, looking for a way to approach the guards unseen. The guard shack was a circular bunker, set against a large pillar. Most of the crew sat outside at a picnic table, playing cards. Between turns, they traded insults and swigs from a flask. Their assault rifles leaned against the table. Ashley noticed that the soldiers had removed their helmets, but not their bulletproof vests. Ash spotted a fifth guard inside the command post, sitting at the terminal, reading a magazine. She suspected he was the one who'd overlooked the arrival of her parents' car. The terminal, registering the new day, clicked over from the events of the previous day to a brand new empty log page. Ashley's arrival had been displayed for less than a minute, reducing the length of time the assigned soldier had to notice and react to the entry. She packed up the binoculars, climbed onto her hoverboard, and slipped away, staying hidden by the parked cars. Across the garage, the guards continued their fun, exhibited by drunken laughter, bragging, and taunting. The Fox family station wagon ticked as it cooled. A few minutes later, a fire alarm went off. "Where is it?" the sergeant yelled to the private, inside the bunker. "Grid 18, he replied, checking his monitors. "Looks like a car fire. There's a bunch of smoke pouring out of a boat down there, Sergeant." 18, move out, the sergeant yelled at the young soldiers. They pulled on their helmets, picked up their rifles, and set off in Ashley's general direction. The troops jogged toward the smoke, billowing from an obscured vehicle far across the garage. As they got closer, they looked around, confused. The smoke had mostly cleared. The car looked fine. One of the soldiers pointed to the nearby pillar. The fire alarm had been pulled and the extinguisher was missing from its mount. A lance corporal moved over to the smoking vehicle and pulled the extinguisher out from under the car. "Can you believe this?" one of the soldiers laughed. "Gentlemen," said the sergeant, "we got a 0 needs a beatin'." "Come on out here, you little cowards," belligerent corporal yelled. "Man, I was winning that hand," another complained, referring to the card game. Ash sailed along, crouched on the hoverboard, the tip of the black-painted scabbard half an inch above the hard cement. She approached the guard shack in a circular fashion, staying behind vehicles when possible. Ashley crossed the last bit of open ground at an angle to the open door and circular window bank. She stopped below the window and set the board on its side. The 15-year-old girl drew the blade from its sheath and set the scabbard next to the board. Sword in hand, she crept forward and silently peeked around the corner of the door. The guard sat, hunched over the control panel, still reading his magazine. Ashley entered the room, smooth and dangerously silent. She reached the back of the soldier's chair and stood. He laughed at something he'd read, without a clue that she was there. Ashley thought about what Captain Gray had said, about keeping the citizens alive. She could knock him out and just plug the drive in. His gun was too far away for him to reach it. She noticed that he was reading a rape porn magazine and laughing about it. The girls in the photos looked tortured and abused. They were not smiling or laughing. With a single strike, Ash severed the young citizen's head from his body. The neck exploded with a geyser of blood, covering the monitors. The head landed on the counter, a few feet from the body, spinning and rolling to a halt. The body was still spinning too, in the office chair. Ashley rolled it away from the terminal and plugged in the drive Gray had given her. The terminal's activity monitor froze. A glance at the monitor showed the guards, still distracted across the structure and generally goofing off. A warning came up on the main terminal, informing the user of a mandatory optimization update. The crash cycle was designed to look like maintenance. She watched the time required indicator climb from 12 to 36, finally hovering at 40 hours. "Genius," she whispered, and stepped back from the machines. Ashley retrieved the scabbard, cleaned the blade, sheathed it, and grabbed her board. Ash pulled the young man's badge from his headless body and tossed it into her pack. She slung his assault rifle over her shoulder and grabbed the canister-shaped grenades from the table. Her pack swollen with plunder. She heard voices and crouched low. Another glance at the monitor showed that the guards had returned. She was trapped. They were right outside the door. Ashley ducked against the half-windowed wall, crouching against the painted bricks, below the glass and to the side of the shell depression beside the reinforced door frame. She set her sword on the floor and drew the detective's handgun. One of the soldiers entered the bunker, "Lentz! Lentz!" he called out. The soldier saw the blood-covered terminal and the headless body. Lentz stared at him sideways from his place down the counter. 2 other soldiers entered. They saw the head, oozing blood and plasma onto the stained counter. When the young girl fired the weapon, several loud explosions were punctuated by the wet slaps of bullets splashing into the young guards' heads and bodies. The soldiers were thrown against the console by the handgun's heavy rounds. They ripped through their uniforms, blowing out blood and muscle as the bullets chewed into their bodies. Ash knew at least one citizen guard remained in the garage, but from her place against the wall, she couldn't see him on the monitors. Ashley's pack of M1 grenades sat on the terminal counter near Lentz's severed noggin. The soldier still hadn't appeared on the monitors. The coast was clear. She slowly stood, seeing no one outside the window. A plastic bag lay on a table nearby. Ash scooped up Lentz's head and floated out of the post on her hoverboard, quickly vanishing among the parked vehicles. No one fired. The sergeant was nowhere to be seen. His staff sergeant Splitter held a hand over his mouth and a gun to the side of his head, both men well inside the invisibility radius of Splitter's phase frequency camouflage. Once Ashley was out of the garage, Splitter knocked the sergeant out and handcuffed him to a picnic table. He double-checked the guard shack. He saw the decapitated body and the bullet-riddled corpses, and noted that Lentz's head had gone missing. He tapped his transmit button. "Captain Snow, we've got a problem." "I noticed the network is down. What's wrong?" she asked. "She killed 4 of them." "Was she defending herself?" "No, she ambushed them." Captain Snow didn't reply. "She didn't give them a chance to surrender or anything." "She's not exactly a trained professional," Snow pointed out. "Captain, these are citizens we're talking about," he replied. "Staff Sergeant, are you having a problem following your orders?" Splitter hesitated. "This mission is a matter of national security. Acknowledge?" "Copy," he replied. "No problems." "Maintain radio silence. Snow out," she replied. Chapter 38. No Remorse. Across the city, a little girl cowered in a tiny dark cell with a floor of cold cement. The single feature of the floor was a small drain. 3 walls of wood and 1 of brick, with a window near the top. She could not reach it. Only the faintest bits of light drifted down to her. There was more during the day, but at night there was very little. She heard an exterior door close somewhere in the house above. Footsteps made the floorboards creak, followed by a few minutes of silence. She thought of home, of her parents and her sister. She cried. She was scared and she missed them. She heard sounds of movement in the basement. The featureless door opened and the burned Dunkirk stood before her. His face had been horribly blackened, his eyes, nose, mouth seared open, exposing charred tissue and teeth. His hair, eyebrows, and skin of his face had been burned off. He'd been transformed into the perfect representation of the monster he truly was, deep down inside. The small girl cowered against the cold brick wall and screamed. Dunkirk tried to grin and bathed in the sound. He grabbed her wrist. She recognized his rings and thick forearms. She screamed even louder. He dragged her from the cell and back down the corridor. She felt him purposefully aim her at the doorframe, taking trouble to cause even the small pains in his boundless cruelty. Now in the monster's work chamber, she screamed herself hoarse. When she stopped to catch her breath, he would growl and snap at her. The walls were covered with particle board tool racks. All manner of weapons, knives, saws, needles, and hammers, all hung for easy access. Ashley rode her hoverboard down the long terraced canyon, the prison garden on the bolt known as the Mall. After fleeing the parking structure for a stairwell, she'd climbed to the vertically central unit, the ground floor of the mall, without encountering any guards or children. Ahead, she spotted a team of guards outside their post. Remembering the news story, she set the rifle down. Rubber bullets wouldn't cut it against 5 of them. Ashley had no idea the weapon was loaded with live ammo. She studied her surroundings, looking for some way to approach while remaining undetected. The mall was mostly open overhead, aside for the occasional bridges that connected one block of the prison to another. She could get past them by taking a higher route, but she needed to enter the hall right next to them. The next crosswalk was just as far away from their post. It wouldn't help her. There was a stairwell she could take up to the next level, but it would expose her to the guards. Ash sent Lentz's head on a waist-high planter and vaulted up. From here she could reach the overhead walkway. A bathroom and stairwell stood in the center of the bridge over the open canyon, creating two gaping maws to pass under. She jumped, caught the edge, and pulled herself up onto it. The crosswalk provided the perfect ambush point. She climbed out over the rail and crouched, concealed against the sidewall. Ash pulled the sword from its sheath and tapped the wooden scabbard against the stone a few times. One of the guards heard her. 200 pounds of ugly, 19-year-old Lance Corporal Lynch gestured for silence from his comrades. He walked toward the crosswalk and paused. "Go check it out," the nearby officer ordered. Lynch walked down the wall. Hallways opened onto the central walk from his left and right. The wide crosswalk looming ahead of him was attached to a large central pillar with a stairwell, creating an island in the river of the cement-floored prison garden. "So someone wants a beating. Well, I'm here to oblige you." He was just barely out of sight of his comrades when he passed under the catwalk. "I'm going to take this stick," Lynch lifted his stun baton over his head, "and I'm going to shove it up your—" Something heavy hit him in the shoulder, knocking him to the ground. He gurgled. Blood ran out of his mouth. Ashley had dropped from the catwalk above and stabbed him through the soft tissue of his throat, straight down into his chest. The weight had slammed him to the ground, the blade shredding his circulatory system. When she pulled the sword out, his lifeblood burst forth in a great splash onto the gray cement. Lynch died before his helmet touched the ground. The collision had been violent and loud. Ashley heard the approaching tromp of another pair of booted feet. She retreated back to her overhead ambush spot. Another, smaller guard rushed over to Lynch's lifeless body, bending over him, inspecting the wound. This time, she dropped to the side and brought the blade down across the exposed back of the soldier's neck. The helmeted head leapt away, and the stump gave several spurts of crimson before the body fell. She listened for more approaching soldiers, but heard nothing. The two young men were strapped with all kinds of gear. Ashley set the little dragon down and unpacked the guards. She got a helmet, a gas mask, 4 tear gas grenades, 2 more assault rifles, and 2 pairs of handcuffs. She secured the gas mask to her waist and snapped on shin, shoulder, and forearm bracers. They were a little too big to wear properly, but fit snugly over her shirt and pants. She pulled on the smaller, headless soldier's vest and donned his recently emptied helmet. Even though he was much smaller than Corporal Lynch, the vest and helmet were both few sizes too big for her, and looked it. She left the assault rifles. If they were loaded with rubber rounds, they were useless. She was tempted to leave Lentz's rifle as well, but didn't. Ash peeked around a corner. The mall was empty. Of the 3 remaining soldiers, no one was standing outside the guard post. She reasoned that they were all inside, huddled around their broken security terminal, probably watching the camera monitors, hoping to catch a glimpse of her. The lithe girl easily avoided the blindly panning cameras and reached the door of the guardhouse unseen. She removed the tear gas canisters from her pack, pulled the pins, and tossed them inside, grabbing the door and slamming it shut. The doors to the guard posts were auto locks, so you needed keys to open them from either side. Ashley heard the soldiers collide with each other in the door. She stepped away, looking into the room through the bulletproof glass. The guards had regrouped from their little accident, but the room was becoming thick with the yellow, potentially lethal gas. The soldiers appeared to be looking for their keys but couldn't find them. They soon disappeared from view. Ashley held her weapon on the door, just in case. After a few minutes, she collected her backpack and Lentz's head. She slung the seemingly useless rubber bullet assault rifle back over her shoulder and walked off. The next post was positioned behind a blind corner and in the center of another bridge. Like the bathrooms behind her, Ashley climbed atop the bridge and shot 3 of the 5 soldiers with Cole's weapon, scoring 2 headshots. Ashley was aiming for the head, as any shot to the armor could be ruled out as a kill shot. The unwounded soldiers dove for the guardhouse, taking cover. 2 of their comrades were dead. The third fumbled with his rifle trying to get a bead on Ashley, but she withdrew. Ash climbed down from the bridge and slipped around the underpass to the left. She came around the corner to find the 3 of them staring at the crosswalk above. 2 more headshots and 2 more guards fell. Ashley had always been good at Jeff's video games, but scoring 4 out of 5 headshots was impressive, even for her. She shifted her aim to the wounded man, on his back against one of the planters, but he had moved on to his next life. His mouth and throat were wet with blood. Ashley suspected the gunfire would bring more soldiers running, but she heard nothing. She had to rearrange the stuff in her pack. Swollen with booty, she twisted and turned the objects until it all fit. Grenades, badges, ammunition. She left nothing behind. A few minutes later, the guards standing outside post 744 heard more gunshots, immediately followed by bullets whizzing past their heads, ricocheting and careening off nearby objects. The shootout they'd heard sounded to be heading their way. The communication terminals were still unresponsive, so the young men took up positions to defend their post. A gas grenade arced through the air, followed by another, tumbling to a stop close by. A nuisance, but the soldiers were still a good distance away. Even a pair of grenades weren't enough to trouble inspiring donning gas masks. Not on the open mall, not yet. A fire extinguisher on a nearby pillar exploded, spewing flame retardant into the air, ruptured with a single shot. Now the smoke grew thick and full. The guards tried to peer through it, but it was pointless. Another object flew toward them. They raised their weapons. The head bounced and rolled, coming free of its bloody plastic. One guard stepped forward and looked down. Fuck, that's Lentz. In the distance, beyond the smoke, another guard appeared, wearing his gas mask and fleeing as yet unseen pursuers behind him. He ran through the smoke, paused to return fire with the rifle, and continued toward them. The rifle pops sounded significantly different than the pistol shots they'd heard earlier. The soldier's helmet bounced painfully on his head. Upon reaching them, he nodded and bent double to catch his breath. He kept the rifle always pointed away from them, generally in the direction of the smoke. The guards watched, waiting out the next few critical moments. The new arrival had turned, positioning himself alongside them, turning to face the enemy pursuing from behind. He leveled his rifle at the smoke, prepared for his pursuers to arrive at any moment. The guards of post 744 stood with him, their weapons likewise pointed into the smoke, determined to put up a fight. As soon as their rifles were up, Ashley shifted the sling-supported rifle over to her left hand. She drew the pistol at her belt. She'd positioned herself correctly. All 4 of them were to her right. The guard closest to her looked over in her direction. She raised the handgun and put a bullet through his face, blowing his brains all over the other young men. She shot the remaining guards before the first man hit the ground. Keeping the mask on, she dashed back through the gas and smoke to retrieve her pack, into which she deposited the newly dead soldiers' grenades, the officer's handgun, extra magazines, and their badges. Finally, the smoke dissipated. She pulled off the helmet and the gas mask. She wiped the sweat from her brow, dropped the helmet, and tucked the mask back into its pouch. She left the rifles where they lie. Across the district, the security communications were down, disrupted by Ashley's hack virus drive. Some posts tried restarting their terminals, but it didn't help. No one had ever reset an entire network before. No one even suggested it. The particle servers, sealed in their artificial environment, continued the false optimization protocol. Only a net-wide power cycle could unlock it, and blindly powering down an airborne facility would be suicide. FBI Director Trafford had been granted access to the district security network, and despite the main server's massive crash, he was still able to surf the active camera feeds. The director watched hundreds of monitors, keeping track of Ashley and scanning for the Reverend. He was only interested in the girl as a means to locate or draw out the reclusive man of the cloth. The cameras displayed one empty hall after another. The district was remarkably quiet, aside from Ashley's calculated assaults. As she ruthlessly destroyed their better-armed outposts, she couldn't help laughing to herself, enjoying the brutal revenge. Chapter 39. No Quarter. In his basement, preparing for the young child's subsequent dismemberment, Dunkirk quite clearly heard the upstairs kitchen door close. He stood, head tilted, and staring at the ceiling. His ruined ears were hardly to be trusted, but it appeared that the child had heard it too. She had paused in her crying. Had he forgotten to lock the kitchen door? The child wailed with all she had. Dunkirk struck her hard enough to knock her senseless, ceasing the lyrical scream. He listened for some time before he eventually wrote the sound off to fatigue and physical trauma. The burned Dunkirk turned back to the child. Gauging her size and weight, he wavered between several wicked-looking tools, trying to define the most satisfying for the job ahead. He narrowed it down to a few favorites and set them within easy reach. An upstairs floorboard creaked. It could have been a normal noise houses make. He meditated on the sensation of the sound and tried to block out his pain. Hearing nothing further, he returned to his preparations and removed the unconscious child's shirt. He lifted her frail body and laid her on the cold metal work table. She stirred and woke. He grinned at her, and the child shrieked. When Dunkirk raised the long silver knife, she screamed louder still. He relished the sound. He felt her terror measurably improve his otherwise miserable mood. Just before the downstroke, Martin distinctly heard the sound of crashing glass on the hardwood floor, directly overhead. This time, he didn't look up. He just lowered the knife. Then he heard the crunch of broken glass under a booted foot. Martin flew across the room to the spiral staircase, the child forgotten. He flung his gorilla-like physique up the narrow spinning stairwell with reckless aggression. On the first floor, moving through the bedroom, he heard calm footsteps on the stairwell leading up to the second floor. Dunkirk moved down the hall and paused in the living room. He listened, but the house was silent again. Martin looked down at the shattered fragments of colored glass. The scattered and crushed shards were the remains of a glass clown knocked from its central place on the shelf. The clown had occupied a place of honor in this, his oldest of homes. It had been there all of his life. He had grown up here, and that glass clown had been the only remaining souvenir of his first victim, his mother. Martin looked about the room to see if anything else was out of place. The room was covered with a thick layer of dust, the front door securely nailed shut. Martin's eyes drifted to the stairwell, leading up to the second floor. Determined to root out the intruder, he approached the stairs, the long blade clutched in a death grip. Halfway up the stairwell he paused, listening. Hearing only silence, he continued. Dunkirk sniffed at the air. The smell of decay was stronger here, but there was something else. Even his ruined nose could detect it. He made a mental note to purchase more deodorizers. The rot was obscuring the intruding odor, making it difficult to identify. At the top of the stairs he stopped. All 3 doors to the upper rooms were open. He never left them open. Never. Not once. The bathroom door on the right, mostly closed, was the only one that should be fully open. Martin walked to the first door on his left. The room was filled with corpses wrapped in heavy plastic. The smell was overwhelming. This was why it smelled on the stairs. He peered inside, but there was no room for anyone to hide. He closed the door. Martin didn't need to check the closets. The doors were difficult to reach and they were packed anyhow. There was no room to fit anyone else in, not even a child. Martin crept to the bathroom door. He pushed it open with his elbow. The scent that had escaped him earlier revealed itself. Alcohol. Rum. He was sure of it. The shower curtain had been pulled back, just as he always left it, open, exposing everything. He could see the rest of the room in the mirror. Satisfied it was empty, he turned back to the hallway. Martin went to the top of the stairs and waited to see if the intruder would perhaps reveal himself below. Behind Mr. Dunkirk, Reverend Wolf slipped out of the bathroom and stepped into the hallway. He raised a terrarium-edged saber and pistol at Dunkirk's back and quietly stepped toward him. From the top of the stairs, Dunkirk watched the daring preschooler walk into the living room below. She had courageously come upstairs. How brave. This one would be sweet. She walked around the broken glass, careful not to step on any of it. Martin began to descend the stairwell, followed by the stealthy Reverend. The girl saw them and backed away. Dunkirk stopped at the base of the stairwell facing her. She looked over his shoulder, at the Reverend behind him. Martin spun and caught the pommel of Wolf's sword in the mouth. The strike lifted him into the air and delivered him directly onto the pile of fractured glass. His head struck the floor with enough force to render him unconscious. Shocked by the corpses she'd left at each post, Staff Sergeant Splitter drifted along behind the lethal Ashley. He knew she'd been instructed to secretly approach the HQ, which wouldn't have been difficult. Instead, she'd chosen to wreak bloody carnage. He was having a difficult time following orders. These citizens were just children themselves. His job was to protect them. Of all the people he'd killed or seen killed, none of them had been civilian citizens. This was wrong. The mayor, in his office, sat in a comfortable chair turned toward the open balcony, a large glass of red wine in his hand. The lights of the city around him burned far brighter than the stars above. Westbury was alone. He charged Leonard with Detective Cole's termination, and the secretary was dutifully searching for the wounded civil servant. Unable to communicate and relatively helpless from their place in the command center, Keller's majors watched Ashley murder her way closer and closer to the elevator banks. They watched as she crouched behind a pillar and drew a second handgun. 2 guards walked right past her. Ashley raised her weapons and dropped both the young soldiers with what appeared to be a simultaneous shot. That post only had a single guard left. Ashley didn't even bother with any subterfuge. Dressed as a soldier in vest and forearm bracers, she boldly walked up to the young man and shot him 3 times. She tossed his badge into her pack, fat with so much glittering brass. At the next post, she coldly killed 4 men without blinking. Her pack grew fatter. Only half a dozen left now, which normally would have been the world, but Ashley treated them like speed bumps. In Martin Dunkirk's childhood home, the Reverend tucked his pistol into his belt. He knelt and picked up Dunkirk's knife. The Reverend set down his saber and with his free hand pinned Martin's arm by the wrist. He spread the hand flat on the ground. Wolf looked over to the little girl and said, "Close your eyes." She shook her head and continued watching. "Please?" the Reverend asked. Again she shook her head. "Oh my God, what is that?" he exclaimed and pointed behind her. Already jittery and terrified, the toddler fell for it, spinning around. Reverend Wolf forcefully drove the knife through Dunkirk's hand, deep into the wood below, pinning it to the floor. The child turned back, realizing she'd been tricked, and caught her breath at the sight of blood spreading from beneath the twitching hand. Wolf stood, sheathed his saber, and crossed over to the little girl. He knelt before her, careful not to make any sudden movements. "I'm going to take you to the police, and they're going to call your parents," he said. She stared at him with wide, unbelieving eyes. "Would you like that?" he smiled. She blinked and nodded, exhaustion washing over her. He stood, picked her up, and carried her from the living room, out through the kitchen. Outside, they crossed the street to a black SUV. He laid her in the back seat. "You'll be safe here. I'll be right back," he said. He smiled and closed the vehicle door. He walked around to the back of the truck and picked up 2 tanks of liquid fuel. The girl watched him carry the heavy tanks across the street and back toward the evil man's house. Wolf set the tanks in the kitchen, pulled all the knives from a decorative wooden block, and carried them into the living room. He kicked the waking Dunkirk forcefully in the ribs. Dunkirk attempted to sit up, but his hand was stuck to the floor. He screamed, or rather howled, without functioning lips. The Reverend stepped forward with another boot, this time to the face. What remained of the man's nose released a fountain of blood. The Reverend sat on the nearby ottoman and fired knives into the floor before him, standing them from their points like a small forest of sharpened steel. "I'm going to ask you some questions. For every question you get wrong, you get a knife. For every question you get right, you get another question." Wolf smiled and gestured to the knives. "They're all yes or no questions, but there's only one right answer. Understand?" Dunkirk silently glared at him. "Okay, that one doesn't count, but this one does." The Reverend pulled the smallest knife from the floor. "Do you know the difference between good and evil?" "Ugh, you," Dunkirk replied, his burned lips inhibiting his attempts at meaningful dialogue. The Reverend pulled his arm back and let the knife fly. The blade sunk into Dunkirk's shin. He screamed. The Reverend pulled a medium-sized knife from its place in the hardwood floor. "Are you willing to confess your crimes and ask the forgiveness of your victims?" Dunkirk glared at the Reverend. Wolf threw the blade at Martin's face. Dunkirk's free arm came up, the blade sinking deeply into the forelimb. He screamed. "You've killed dozens of people, is that right?" "Hundreds," Dunkirk leered. The Reverend plucked another blade from the floor. "Are you willing to ask our victims for forgiveness?" Dunkirk caught his breath. "Ah, you said our. Ah!" He laughed, his grim rictus a shredded tapestry of black and red. "I won't ask you again," the Reverend said. Martin began tugging at the hand pinned to the floor, desperately trying to work it free. The Reverend hurled the next knife at him. It bit deep into the meat of Martin's pinned shoulder. The arm fell limp and ceased its bid for freedom. "Okay, now we get to the hard ones." Reverend Wolf pulled one of the long blades from the floor. "These you can't throw so well. Needs to be done in more of a stabbing motion." He stabbed the knife into the air before Dunkirk's face. Dunkirk scowled with his ruined brows. "Do you accept the Lord Jesus Christ as your personal savior?" "Och you!" Martin sneered. The Reverend knelt and deliberately stabbed the knife through one of Dunkirk's meaty thighs, driving it into the floor beneath. "This one is important, so I'll give you another chance. Are you willing to accept the Lord Jesus Christ as your personal God and Savior?" Martin hissed in the Reverend's face. Reverend Wolf pulled the man's leg flat and stabbed the knife clean through his second thigh. "Only a couple left, and they're pretty big. You want to keep screwing around?" Dunkirk didn't answer. Wolf laughed. "Well, that one doesn't count either." In a massive display of strength, Dunkirk reached over and pulled the knife from his pinned hand. Reverend Wolf leaned forward and stabbed him in the chest, between the ribs, puncturing a lung. Wrong answer. Dunkirk dropped the small blade. Wolf pulled the last knife from the floor. It was the largest, the thick, heavy butcher knife. "You haven't gotten any right yet." He let Dunkirk get a good look at the blade. "Ready for another one?" Dunkirk scowled and struggled to breathe. "Are you sorry for the pain you've caused?" Dunkirk tried to lift his arm, but could not. The Reverend knelt before him. "Are you sorry?" Dunkirk took a deep breath, summoning his strength. "I'll kill you!" The Reverend drove the butcher knife deep into Martin's other lung. Dunkirk fell back against the floor, gasping for breath. Wolf stood and exited the room as Dunkirk blew blood bubbles from his mouth. Wolf went down into the basement and scanned it with an infrared camera, confirming that the house was empty. In the kitchen, he unscrewed the cap from the first of the fuel containers and splashed it onto the floor and walls. The Reverend toured the house, dousing it with the high-octane gasoline. He then returned to Dunkirk, pinned to the floor, splashing the fuel in a circle around him, around the walls of the living room, but leaving the floor directly around him relatively dry. Reverend Wolf knelt next to Dunkirk. Mysterious ways, you know. Wolf then exited and lit the hallway behind him. Fire leapt up the walls, across the floor, and up the stairwell. It surrounded Dunkirk and appeared to growl at him, the way a pack of hyenas might. Outside, the Reverend didn't look. "Forgive me, Lord, your servant is weak." He crossed the street to the SUV. The child was asleep in the back seat. He reached over and tousled their hair as they lifted off. "Sleep tight, darling. He'll never hurt anyone again." Chapter 40. Burning Bridges. On District 13, Captain Gray set his last mine on a strut between the Bolt and the athletic complex. He triggered his radio. "All right, gents, done with Phase 1. Commencing Part 2. "Finished here too," Captain Snow replied. "I'm going to see a couple guys about a boat." First Sergeant King and Corporal Sorpressa floated through the 00, placing their last mines on braces and beams. "We're wrapping up. See you when we get out back." Captain Snow triggered a radio. "Hey Kilo, Splitter says our girl is swimming through this mission. I thought you told her to stay dry." "Kids nowadays. What can you do?" King laughed. "Kilo, you copy?" Snow asked Captain Gray directly. "Snow, this is Kilo. What channel is Splitter on?" "Deuce Deuce," she answered. "All right, gents. I'm going radio silent while I wake the docks. Do what you have to do. Snow out." At the lowest of the connecting struts, First Sergeant King lit Corporal Sorpressa's torch. He attacked the beam, the superheated metal blasting into the air around them. The plasma torch ripped through the metal like butter. Sorpressa laughed and First Sergeant King smiled. Ashley paused to take stock of her resources. 3 guards stood between her and the elevator bank. There was a lot of open space between them, too far for the handgun. The elevator doors opened and 3 more guards stepped out. Armitage says keep your eyes open. Shoot anything that moves. The 3 new uniforms set out at a jog, away from the hedge where Ashley crouched in shadow. She planned her route, and whenever the remaining men turned away or adjusted their stances, Ashley slipped closer. There were small pockets of cover between them, a planter here, a park bench there, 30 feet, then 20, 10. Materializing from the shadows, she slipped up behind a corporal and drove the little dragon through the soft tissue above the crest of his hip, above his pants, just under his vest. The oiled blade pierced a kidney, spreading poison up into the lungs and severing major arteries before bursting out through the soft tissue of the throat. The 2 other guards could hardly see her and hesitated to fire directly at their comrade. Holding the dead corporal upright with one hand, Ashley drew the detective's handgun and fired twice, killing the 2 standing men. Ash pulled her blade from the NCO and stepped back. The 3 of them collapsed together. She stepped over to the elevator bank and pressed the call button. While she waited, she stuffed her overflowing backpack with more grenades and badges. Mostly the guards had smoke or tear gas grenades, but she'd found a few of the lethal kind as well. The elevator dinged. Ashley raised the handgun, ready to fill the car with hot lead. The doors opened. The car was empty. She propped it open with one of the dead soldiers and hit the call button again. Her pistol at the ready, another set of doors opened. She propped this one open as well, and then a third. The 4th car she jammed open with the backpack. In the first car, Ash hit the button for the top floor, the guard's HQ. She popped 2 gas grenades inside and pushed the dead guard all the way in. The doors closed. In the second car, she sent 2 more grenades to the top floor, along with another dead man for the ride, and did the same with the third. Ashley strapped the backpack over her shoulders and slid the hoverboard between the pack and her back. She stepped into the 4th car and donned her gas mask. She hit the button for the top floor and popped a gas grenade. She pulled the pins on 2 more as they climbed toward the command post. Across the district, Captain Snow approached a pair of heavy bolted doors. She landed and powered down her face cam. She waved a key card at an access panel and the gate rolled back. The district guard standing inside snapped to attention and saluted the officer. "Wake the resident doctors," Snow ordered. "Have them call me here from their control center." Before long, a nearby monitor fired up, and a fresh-faced lieutenant saluted and sounded off. Behind him, 2 sleepy-eyed doctors stood silently. Captain Snow took the lead. "I've been sent to inform you that this facility has been compromised. Your internal network is secure, but the remainder of the district is blacked out. Prepare 7982 for Emergency Evacuation Protocol 3 Alpha." "Which one is that?" the thin doctor asked. "The underwater one," his rotund colleague replied. "Aren't they all underwater?" "It's the deep one." "How deep?" 36 months. "Does that mean I can go back to sleep now?" The round one laughed. "It means if you stay up for the next few hours and help me, you can sleep for a week." "You've got a deal." Outside, along the back of the wing, King and Sorpresa held torches to the connecting metal braces. Snow arrived and triggered her radio. "Splitter, what have you got?" "Kid is already inside the bank and moving upward." "And you were disappointed with her progress." "Well, she's killed everyone. We'll have to arrest her." "Now before she carries out her mission, Staff Sergeant." "This was supposed to be a dry op," Splitter asserted. "She's not a soldier. She doesn't have to follow orders like you. Do you copy, Sergeant?" "Yes, sir. Splitter out." Snow looked over to King and Sorpresa. "Where's Gray?" she asked. They shrugged. "God damn it. Keep on it. I'll be right back." Captain Snow pushed off and flew her gravity suit up into the night. As her elevator neared the headquarters, Ashley could hear the commotion. The command post was a madhouse, roaring chaos. As the doors opened, she tossed the grenades in her hands and drew her handguns. The car unleashed more gas into the command center, and it unleashed Ashley. Wearing the mask, she stepped out. She methodically picked her targets and opened fire. The guards and technicians fell around her. She spared no one. In less than 30 seconds, Ashley had fired her weapons over 100 times. Her fingers were sore, burning. Over 20 had fallen and none of them moved. She crossed and entered the server room. In order to broadcast on the video screens, She'd need the internal network up and running. She leaned over the network communication grid, found the cable for Terminal 726, post in the garage where she'd inserted the drive, and disconnected it. They didn't want to cut power to the network running the gravity drives, and so Ashley selected the system carefully. She located and rebooted only the particle servers running the communication systems, like Gray had told her, by briefly interrupting the circuit. There was no need to reboot the entire system, as long as you knew where the problem was. Ashley traced the cables to the main router, which she disconnected and removed. Without it, no one on the district could make a call. Nothing could be transmitted. No citywide alarms could be sounded. Ironically, this situation was only possible on controlled districts, like prisons and schools, in those places where the main router was always located in the most restricted and controllable location: administration offices, command posts, headquarters. The router in her pack, she smiled. Objective 2 complete. Far below her, on the open mall, Splitter argued with Gray. Special Agent Kilo, yeah, you told her to do this, didn't you? I told her not to. Bullshit. You're the big badass. Killed 1,000 guys all locked into tubes. Yeah, you're real tough. Gray stepped forward and punched Splitter in the mouth, knocking him from his feet. You son of a bitch! The staff sergeant scrambled up and leapt at the newly promoted captain. Gray stepped off the line of attack and delivered a stinging blow to the side of Splitter's head. The staff sergeant stumbled to the ground, his balance knocked out of alignment. Splitter got to his feet but had a hard time standing. He didn't raise his hands. It took all of his concentration not to collapse to the ground. He wobbled on his knees, holding his hands up between himself and Gray. Captain Snow landed between them. I have 3 torches sitting cold because you two were out here proving your manhood to one another. Splitter dropped to a knee. The fuck did you do to him? She snapped at Gray. I need him working. Splitter coughed a couple times and finally straightened up. It took him a minute, but he managed to point a wavering finger at Captain Snow. This is bullshit, he said. She's out there killing citizens. Get political on your own time. Right now I need you on a torch. Snow stepped directly into Splitter's face. I suggest you get to it. Splitter shook his head, took a moment to get his balance, and lifted off toward the 7982 wing. Snow turned to Gray. Remember who the stranger is here, Captain. Gray didn't reply. Captain Snow turned her elevation dial and lifted off. Gray watched them with his newly enhanced vision, and followed to the next task. Within minutes, there were 5 torches burning through the metal beams, holding the Project 7982 laboratory to District 13. Chapter 41. Wrecking Homes. Ashley stepped out of the command center onto an exterior patio and pulled her gas mask off. She immediately found herself face to face with 24 coughing, puking guards. Unarmed, they hesitated, their weapons forgotten in the panic. Ashley's guns came up as the soldiers charged her. Her weapons tore through the front line, hitting them in the chest, the neck, and the face. The caseless ammo spewed from her weapons. Even at this rate, it would take her a while to burn through the 1,000-round magazines. The next wave attacked with anything they could find. The air around her was suddenly alive with projectiles, mostly patio furniture, broomsticks, chairs, chair legs flying at her head. Discovering her handguns useless against the flying furniture, she drew the little dragon. Ash darted through the guards' ranks, opening an artery here, severing a tendon there. Every movement a perfect strike, block, or parry. For every hit the guards scored, Ash made 5. One after another they fell, until all who would stand against her couldn't. Ash alone remained on her feet. Ashley cleaned her sword and sheathed it. The rooftop was a dead end. There was nowhere to go from here. Tear gas still wafted from the command center. She looked down at her filtration mask. It was covered in gore. She didn't reach for it. Ash pulled the hoverboard from beneath her pack. She stepped onto it, took a deep breath, opened a door and kicked back inside. She shot across the large room toward the stairwell. She didn't breathe again until she'd dropped several floors. The board, a Vertical 4 Classic, was composed of light beryllium alloy, soaked, cured, and varnished in the liquid T256 isotope. When fully charged and properly ridden, the Vert 4 was unstoppable, an icon of hoverboarding engineering. As it flowed over the ground, the ride was tailored for the rider. The V4 was smooth, it corrected mistakes, choosing the best and safest paths ahead, navigating around any impending difficulties, and was especially good at compensating for stairs. The model's built-in auto-correction algorithms set the standard for everything else on the market. Newer models were either significantly better than the V4 and disgustingly overpriced, or considerably worse and costing only slightly less. When Ashley and her V4 dropped into the stairwell, it was as though she were surfing down a water slide, while riding the tight turns at the landings in a constant counterclockwise spin. She stretched out into the drop, her right arm reaching up high, her left ahead of her. She let the board plot the course and focused on balancing with it. Back home, less than 2 weeks ago, Ashley had lived in a top-shelf residential district. While she'd ridden stairwells before, she'd never attempted anything like this. It was like a half-pipe, except she was carrying a pack, a gun, and a sword. She found herself working to balance the sword and the rifle, while still compensating for the bulky weight of the armored vest and the backpack. Sinking onto the board, she flew downward, faster and faster. The hairpin 180 at each landing came quicker and snapped harder each time. The gas was long gone, the floor numbers blurred by. She tucked in her arms and let out a sigh and spun downward at a blinding speed. It was difficult enough to focus on riding, let alone planning, but she knew that when the stairwell hit the center floor, it would flatten out and open up. She couldn't continue downward indefinitely, but how was she going to slow herself down? In the distance, the final floor spun toward her, only half a dozen flights away now. She tried to slow for it, leaning back and taking more of an arc at the landings. She saw the doorway she'd need to hit when she crashed into the flat opening below. She lined up, anticipating the force she'd need to stay in control and ride out the next few seconds. The floor came at her with dizzying speed. She kicked and ducked, the force exerted on her body by the sudden change of direction pushing her down on the board while flinging it upward. Crouching as low as she could, Ashley barely missed the top of the doorframe. Her head cleared it by the smallest of margins. It would have knocked her out. Apparently, even the V4 had its limits. Ash didn't want to find the board's breaking point. She steered over to a patch of close-cropped lawn, stumbled off the board, and collapsed. For a couple minutes, she didn't move. Then she struggled out of the backpack and ditched the gun belt. Lying on her back, the Micronix was digging into her butt as she was feeling nauseous. She rolled onto her side and tossed her cookies. After puking up everything in her stomach, then coughing herself blue, she lay still, just breathing. Ash looked over at the Vert 4. It spun in lazy circles. The front end tipped and anchored, while the power back drifted half a foot off the ground, kind of like Evans had all those years ago, after he'd kicked it at her in the clearing. The Micronix, it had fallen out of the sky. The original. As far as she knew, it was still in her locker. Hopefully Jeffrey had it. That day, Bobby and Evan had been exposed. Bobby had carried the infection home, exposing his father, Mr. Dunkirk, but he'd been killing for years. Ashley paused. It was the sensation. Time. She felt it again now. She sat up. She heaved again, but her stomach was empty. A cold sweat hit her and she struggled to her feet. The vestibular humors in her ear were still rolling, giving her the false sense of moving when she was standing still, and making her feel still while moving. She took a breath and felt, for a moment, as if every pore had opened, and she had taken a big drink of oxygen. She exhaled and her skin tightened. She took another breath and the sensation lessened somewhat. 2 breaths later, and it was gone. The knife, one in her pocket, one in her locker. They were both here now. The prototype, it was a direct computer-brain interface, the Micronix. As a computer, her father had been able to do almost anything with it. Jeff could use it, but Ash hadn't been interested. Chairman Pierce had known her father. She learned that later. Yet it wasn't just the knife. It was also her father. Every time. It was his life that had put her here. Ashley shook her head. On some level, everyone's circumstances could be traced back through their parents. Everyone's grandparents could be held responsible if one looked far enough. Ashley knew her father hadn't created the world. What had happened here was not his fault. Her father hadn't tried to rape Skye. Her father hadn't kicked Jeffrey down the massive escalator. Her father wasn't hanging out with a gang of serial killers who were trying to eat her. That was insane. Where did Dunkirk come into it? He'd been killing for years, but Ashley was also a killer now. She'd trained for it, and this had been her test. She'd trained well. Ash had left the knife in her locker when she went to breakfast. That Saturday, Jeff went missing. She hadn't been back to it since. It seemed like a lifetime ago. Ashley shook her head. Now was no time to have a religious experience. She coughed a couple times and blew out foul puke breath. She looked around for a drinking fountain. There was one right nearby. After a drink, she pulled the Vert 4 over to her pack and lay down. Using the hoverboard as a pillow, the weapons clutched to her chest. The detective's handgun was black, the officer's silver. The bracers and vest were stamped in black and fringed in red. Her face was stained red, her clothes, hair, thick and heavy with blood. She lay canted to the left, so the micronics wouldn't dig into her butt. After a few minutes, she managed to calm her body down, but her brain was way too excited to relax. She pulled on the backpack, slung the rifle, holstered the handgun, and slid the sword through her belt. She was so weighed down with gear, she would have had a miserable time walking. The stairs would have been impossible, but the Vert 4 hoverboard made everything possible. It made her footsteps silent. It made her stronger than she really was. Ashley realized it was perhaps her most valuable possession. She drifted through the garden like a wraith and reached the athletic complex without meeting any unlucky citizen soldiers. Dr. Morgenstern's head was still wrapped with gauze when he and Colonel Keller arrived on the street outside the Dunkirk childhood home. Only moments after Reverend Wolfe left, they parked in the very space he had vacated. Smoke was pouring from the Dunkirk house. It was obvious it was on fire, but still too early to have caught anyone's attention. They crossed the street and entered through the unlocked kitchen door. Despite the bleeding bandages, Morgenstern moved as though he could see perfectly well. He and the colonel were surprised to find Martin pinned to his living room floor, bleeding and struggling to breathe. Upon seeing them, Dunkirk attempted to speak, but succeeded only in blowing blood all over himself. Morgenstern shook his head in disappointment. Keller knelt and stared into Dunkirk's burnt and ruined face. He showed him the black-edged machete. Dunkirk closed his eyes. The blade made a deep thwack as it bit into the hardwood floor beneath the man's neck. Dunkirk's head rolled away from his body and Keller scooped it into a plastic bag. A couple miles away, Reverend Wolfe parked outside a police station. He lifted the sleeping child from the back seat and carried her through the front door of the building, up to the reception desk. The young desk sergeant looked up. "Can I help you?" "Yes." Reverend Wolfe handed the toddler to the officer. "I found this lovely child wandering the streets. Please return her to her parents." The officer took the child and held her in his arms. He looked at her. "I've got a little girl too. We'll find your parents, sweetheart. I promise." "Where'd you find her?" he asked, looking back to the Reverend. The officer froze. He was alone. He hadn't heard the door open or heard the man leave. He was just gone. Captain Snow adjusted the black fabric strung between the old orphanage and the Special Projects wing. It concealed the torch-wielding soldiers from wandering eyes. The soldiers' phase cam systems couldn't suppress the torch's flame, but behind the black velvet, they could work without fear of discovery. The operators focused behind their welding masks, burning through the struts. Standing on the roof, Kilo pulled out his control module and double-checked the detonators as Snow scanned the district for activity. Everything was quiet. Splitter finished cutting his assigned braces and joined them on the rooftop, making an awkward situation downright chilly. King waved, signaling that he and Sorpresa were almost finished. Captain Snow's phone vibrated. The administrators on 7982 were ready. She gestured and the three of them climbed down into the braces. From their belts, the agents connected Terrellium lanyards, replete with lockable D-rings, to the structure. They fished the cable out longer than necessary and fed a loop through the gap in the strut, snapping it into the ring. If they had to disconnect in a hurry, the thick cable could be twisted out and it would spring from the gap. Much easier than trying to maneuver a D-ring through a strut while dropping at terminal velocity. Gray realized that everyone, even Sorpresa, had watched to see if he would buckle up like a newbie or not. When he noticed they'd been watching, they all laughed. Gray had held his own with the torch, both fast and accurate, a skill only acquired after hours of practice. Kilo had spent more than one night with the combat engineers. Boarding and commandeering a freestanding structure was one thing. Stealing one that's bolted down is quite another. The wing did have its own Terrellium drive, but it could not be counted on for accurate maneuvering power. Just strapping into the top of the slide was serious commitment. As the winds picked up, the team felt the anxiety acutely. Big units often shifted when first separating from their mother structures, and struts had a habit of impaling engineers. As Sopresta finished with the final brace, Snow gave the signal for the others to power up. They charged their gravity drives and pulled the cables tight. Snow pointed at Sopressa. He adjusted his elevation controls until the lanyard pulled tight. Snow gave a final signal and the soldiers directed their gravity drives in a concerted effort, increasing the pressure against the back wall structure, pushing the wing from the bulk of the district. The final bits of metal, anything still slightly connected, began to snap off. There were a few pings, and with a high-pitched metallic scream, it broke free. The wing's drives had been powered down, and the unit shifted like a boulder at the edge of a cliff. A moment later, the building slid over the lip of the gravity well, plunging from the district. The cables of the black box had been designed to prevent the escape or entrance of vehicles. The building wasn't using its magnetic drives, and the cables couldn't have held it anyhow. They caused only the slightest pause as the wing dropped. It slid over the charged city, flying out to sea like a piece of ice on glass, the buildings below keeping it aloft for now. The soldiers hung on, the city lights flying fast below them.